right? I'm Chilean, I was born in Chile, but I grew up in the United States, and that's just not a feeling that anyone has really experienced further north, right? And not only that, it's really important for people to see, particularly folks who, we're all internationalists, we're all socialists here, to see what's possible in other countries, and not just in some country, halfway around the world, our neighbors right to the south. So I think it was a great experience. I think everybody was thrilled to be part of it.
Who else wants to jump in on that? Share with us that raw emotion. What did you feel witnessing this happening, understanding that you're part of an important effort to build these bridges, that this is really, in a sense, just the beginning, that hopefully this is something that we'll be talking about a few years down the road of saying, this is when we understood that these concrete links between our peoples are actually going to be strengthened.
Yeah, so I just, to me, it shows us what's possible, right? It shows us that it is possible in a country like Mexico to see a candidate like Claudia Sheinbaum win, to see a party like Morena get the support that it has. I grew up in the 90s. I came of age during Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, or as you all had in Mexico, Vicente Fox, Felipe Calderon, a society that was very conservative, right? A political system that was dominated by the right wing. And to see all of that change just in the last 6 years has been remarkable. Being here to see it shows us what's possible, right? As far as us in the United States. Being here shows us that one word, when you mentioned El Zocalo, one word in particular I think has been stuck in my head when I think about how we can make this also possible in the United States, a word that Claudia used. And that word was plural. Building a movement that is plural, that recognizes the differences that we have, that you all have here in Mexico, is what has made this possible, to build a coalition like Morena, recognizing the different peoples that come across all of Mexican society. And that's something we grapple with in the United States as well. So once again, being able to see this has been deeply inspiring for me, speaking for myself, and I think speaking for the others here as well, right? Being able to bring this back to the United States, right? To show people that it is possible and that we can do it as well, and that we need to do it.
So part of why we're here at this conference and why we do the work we do is to build exactly what Jose Luis said, which is transnational solidarity, right? From the U.S. side towards Mexico and from the Mexico side towards the United States. And I think it might be interesting to explore a little bit some of the obstacles that exist and have existed in this historically and in recent years. From the Mexico side, I've been writing in Jacobin over the entire course of AMLO's administration, trying to say, hey, this is something the left in the United States should be paying attention to. There's some interesting stuff going on down here. And we also have our podcast in English to try to counter just the awful slew of media attacks from the United States towards the 4T. And then on the other side, from the US side, the DSA is doing some incredible work in outreach towards Latin America in general and Mexico in particular. And that's very, very valuable, incredible work, and we're all very happy to have you here for this election. So, but maybe we can talk about what are the obstacles on both sides? Or what are the obstacles you see from the US, In the U.S., there is Cuba solidarity, and there's Venezuela solidarity, and there's, Puerto Rican activism, and there's, but Mexico seems to get overlooked. And that's particularly a shame when, there's a solid left movement now that has just won 2 landslide elections. Jorge, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, for sure. When we think about the history of the US, there's a particular fact that is not usually mentioned, or at the very least, it's glossed over. which is that many states in the United States were stolen from Mexico. And many of the people who live in those states, like California, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Texas, one could keep going, are from those lands. You know, I'm one of those people. And if one doesn't talk about that, then it becomes easier to integrate those people into the project of what the United States is doing. When we discuss Cuba solidarity or Venezuela solidarity, it becomes a much easier reality to many people in the United States to grasp, as it's something that is over there. This is not to say a subjective statement of whether this is good or bad, but rather an observation of what is the reality. Venezuela and Cuba are countries that historically have been colonies. Cuba has been a colony of the United States, but nonetheless are independent from the US, famously so. And this is why there's so many sanctions against these countries. Puerto Rico, I would say, is in many ways very similar to the plight of the Mexican people within the United States, in that if you do not acknowledge that reality, then it becomes easier to understand it as part of the existing project of the United States. However, because Puerto Rico is disenfranchised, there is a much stronger alienation, much stronger resentment that the subjects of Puerto Rico have towards the government of the United States. So there is a much more concrete oppression that the Puerto Rican people have and can point to, as their voice is not accounted for in the electorate, in the political system, in the electoral system of the United States. Whereas there is a bifurcation that has occurred with the Mexican diaspora in the United States. There are those who are on one side of the border, and there are those that are on the other side of the border. There are those who come and go to the United States that either went through the Byzantine, difficult to understand if one does not know English, the many barriers it is to become a citizen of the United States, to move to the United States, to immigrate to the United States, or to do so anyway, that there is two different lives that are involved in that. And so, unless people are from these lands natively, then what ends up occurring is that, oh, well, I'm Mexican, but I'm not Mexican from Mexico, which does create an almost double consciousness, a double image that one has about one's place in the world, that one can somehow remove oneself from the specific ways that one is in the world. And rather it's, oh, I'm more like them. I'm not this other that we all agree upon we don't want to be. So to answer your question in terms of the barrier as to Mexican solidarity, is many Mexican diaspora has to understand, must truly grasp that the project of the self-determination, of the freedom, the liberty of the people of Mexico includes them as well. And that is why I would say that in this year, leading into this election, many politicians, particularly Republican ones, but also Democrats as well, have been beginning a propaganda push to delegitimize the democratic process that's occurring here in Mexico. Because if you start claiming that, oh no, there's no way that someone could possibly have the support of 80% of the population. These people are brainwashed, these people are stupid, or they're lying and they're stealing. If you start implanting that idea in people's minds, rather than implanting an idea into their minds and tell them that their eyes are lying to them, their lying eyes deceive them, rather than what is the truth, which is policies that help the majority of the people, turns out majority of people like.
Hi, I've lived in Los Angeles since 1967, and so over my life, I've seen Los Angeles become, a mainly Latino city. And of course, the very large, am I doing this right? Yeah. Okay, not used to a mic. And so, of course, of that majority, the majority of Latinos are from Mexico. And then, but there's also a very large number of Salvadorans and Guatemalans. And I was very lucky when I was only 18 to get involved with a group of left-wing organizers who were, political refugees from 1968. They were at UNAM, or from the war in El Salvador, or, the dirty war in Guatemala. And so I learned a lot from them. And I see similar things today in that they were really helping to reignite the labor movement in Los Angeles. And today, we see the labor movement is growing more militant and more political in Los Angeles, and that is largely led by Latinos. I think an obstacle is that most working class people in Los Angeles, especially Latinos, are concerned with everyday survival. And so they mainly organize around being able to have housing, being able to have health care, having jobs, conditions on the job, everything like that. And so they aren't as involved in active participation across borders as would be great for the solidarity between the working class and the left of our countries. But friends of mine who are, working class Latinos and members of our organization in Los Angeles, have been texting me the last few days, and everywhere they go, in the laundromat, in the cafe, the bar, everybody is watching television and talking about Morena's victory. So I think this is a moment we have to seize. And was very fortunate a couple days ago, a few of us were able to attend a meeting with some labor unions here in Mexico. And I was especially thrilled because we met with the Actors Union, and the Actors Union in Los Angeles and across the country was on strike last year, and especially in Los Angeles because of Hollywood, the industry as we call it. And also we were able to meet with organizing auto workers. And in Los Angeles, that's not where we have many auto factories because, there's been a kind of deindustrialization of a lot of these factories. But students in the universities are joining the United Auto Workers, and they're presently on strike at the University of California with their demands having to do with working conditions, but also with the police attacks on students because they support Palestine. So I think this is a great moment for internationalism and for working across different sectors, the left, students, union workers, to build that solidarity we all need.
I'll just say briefly to answer Kurt's question about, in terms of stumbling blocks, I see two things. Primarily, it's the class issue, right? In that the vast majority of the left in the United States is middle class, right? And so the narrative about poverty that AMLO and leaders within 4T and Morena have embraced is something that we need to get on board with in the US left, centering poverty, right? We talk about class, but we don't necessarily talk about poverty to the extent that we absolutely should. And the second thing is also racial, right? So I remember a couple years ago when I was doing, and I still continue to do Venezuela solidarity work, talking with a young guy in my chapter, a young white guy in my chapter, who was very honest with me. It was a refreshingly honest conversation. I asked him, like, I don't understand how people in the United States on the left aren't inspired by Hugo Chavez. Like, he's such an inspiring figure to me. And so he just said, like, you know, I'm a white guy, and I love Jeremy Corbyn, and that's who I identify with. And it was a really powerful moment for me personally because, I'm Latin American. Obviously, that's what I'm going to gravitate to. We have to recognize that if you're middle class and white in the United States, you're probably going to gravitate towards a left of the past, right? A revolution of the past based in the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, that type of thing. But obviously the left exists. It's growing, particularly in the global south, not just in Latin America, right? The global south. And so those are kind of some of the stumbling blocks that I see within the left in the United States.
So I wanted to pick up on this thread of internationalism. And I'm going to put some of you on the spot a little bit here. Because like I mentioned, we've had a chance to have private conversations and kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what this actually work looks like. And so I wanted to ask, what compelled you to engage in the work of struggle within your own organizations to actually do this work? Because I was doing an interview for an article that was preparing in the context of the elections, and I was interviewing Rafael Barajas, El Fisgón, and he said something I thought was spot on. I was asking, is there a deliberate effort to create these divides? Is that what's happening? Is there a strategy behind this? Some kind of interference by our adversaries? And he said, yes. The thing about transformations is that they're contagious. And I actually am convinced that part of the reason there is this deliberate divide between the left or even progressive forces more broadly between the United States and Canada the United States and Mexico, is precisely that people might get the wrong idea, and actually start to do this kind of work. One of the things that I always talked about on the speaking tour was that, I understand that the political system in the United States is a behemoth, right? You kind of think about the two-party system, the dominance of it, all of the different barriers that they put up to kind of keep that ruling class structure in place, and it does seem insurmountable. But then I told them, I think if you told us in the year 2013 that in the next election López Obrador would win a landslide, I would have thought, that's impossible. It's too difficult. In the same way, the political institutions in Mexico almost seemed insurmountable. You had this very strong dominance of largely the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the National Action Party, and now we've seen with López Obrador that they were decimated. And now, with Claudia Sheinbaum, they're almost reduced to rump status. Some of them may even lose their party status. The PRD looks like it's going to lose its status. And so, even though it seems insurmountable, it is proof that even in the most challenging of circumstances, these structures can be dismantled. And so, again, to go back to my question, can you talk about where the conviction came to do the work, to engage, to try to do this within your own organizations, to convince them? Austin in particular, I know you and I had this conversation about what it took to turn the IC into an organization that's actually doing internationalist work. Fill us in. What was behind that? Why did you do it? And what did it look like? What did it take to actually do it? Because I think a lot of people need to do this similar work in their own organizations.
Sure. No, that's a very interesting question, Jose Luis, a very important question. And in answering that question, I even also pivot back to Kurt's earlier question about, or one of the points Kurt made as far as people in the United States not really paying any sort of interest or any sort of really caring about what's happening in Mexico. When results were beginning to filter out that Claudia was going to win and win big, we saw an outpouring on social media of politicians from across the hemisphere. You want to guess where we didn't see a single progressive politician say anything? The United States. Bernie, nothing. AOC, nothing. Why? Right? Why, like, of any political project of the left within the Americas, you would think affinity with a movement like Morena in the largest southern, or in the United States' southern neighbor, its largest neighbor, would be inherently relevant to them and to their movement, and would bolster their positions in the United States. It's just good strategically for them, right? And yet they still don't do it. This was the impetus for joining DSA and overhauling, or beginning the process of overhauling its foreign policy structures, ending the consistent cycle that I have seen in my entire life of the left and the socialist movement in the United States being completely absent in dialogue in our hemisphere and across the world. As I said earlier, I came of age during George W. Bush and Vicente Fox, but I also came of age during Hugo Chavez. And what did Chavez say consistently? He didn't say, oh, people in the United States, I hate you. No, he said, people in the United States, you're my brothers and sisters too. I want to help the people in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, right? Sending heating oil and material to indigenous peoples on reservations in the United States. And what did the US left do consistently? Ignore it. Turn a cold shoulder, right? Something I say to Luisa and Jorge and so many people within DSA consistently is that because we are in the United States, because it's our government interfering in Guatemala, in Mexico, in El Salvador, in Brazil, everywhere across the world, it is incumbent upon us to be answering the phone when people across the world are trying to reach us. Being people in the United States that people across the world can connect to, right? This was the major impetus toward overhauling some of the structures of the International Committee of DSA. But as you kind of touched upon, Jose Luis, that wasn't very easy to do, right? Well, I'd say, kind of leaning a little bit on what my dear comrade Luisa just mentioned as far as the attitudes of people within the US left, right? A lot of it, I would agree, comes from middle-class background, white background, right? I'd say the average leftist in the United States, and some may disagree with me, right, does not view foreign policy as a priority, right? Does not view foreign policy as anything worth putting any sort of emphasis on, right? Whereas I, of course, take the opposite perspective, which is it is our government in the United States wreaking havoc across the world, right? If we want to see projects like Cuba be able to actually develop, it is incumbent upon us to be fighting our government to stop strangling Cuba or Venezuela or putting pressure on Mexico, right? And because I think I can, maybe put a little bit of an optimistic spin here, right? I think people like myself, Luisa, Jorge, either immigrants or children of immigrants, right? We have a whole generation in the United States of immigrants or children of immigrants getting involved in the political process in the United States in ways that hasn't happened before, right? And because of this, you're beginning to see organizations like DSA change. Did I think when we were starting the IC overhaul that we would be in Mexico City 3 years later on a panel speaking to other comrades? No. No. But I learned that there were people like Luisa, people like Jorge, people like Leone, that I was not alone despite feeling alone because of being consistently let down by leaders of the US left. So once again, I put a little bit of an optimistic spin on the end of this question, which is, though I perceived it to be difficult, it became a lot easier with people like Luisa, Jorge, and many others with me in overhauling these structures, right? Being able to send a delegation to Peru, which was one of our first election observer delegations in 2021. Being able to send a delegation to Venezuela, where I first met Jose Luis, right? And I bring up these delegations in particular, right, and this delegation in Mexico as well, because These are not merely opportunities for us to eat tacos, right? Go to lucha libre shows. These are opportunities to learn from what the people here are doing, right? To bring that back to the United States. I was at least happy to see many DSA members cheering on Claudia, right? Happy to see the victory. That's encouraging, and once again, a reflection of the progress that we've made politically on foreign policy within the organization. And once again, it's these sorts of inspiring moments that give us the ability to come back and deepen and strengthen that work. And ideally, be able to win victories in the United States as well, to stop the things that our government in the United States is doing across the hemisphere and across the world. And I'll leave it at that.
Yes, sir. Luisa, go ahead. Yeah, your thoughts.
I'll say briefly, it started for me, at least the importance of Mexico, or me wanting the desire to do solidarity work was Trump's comments about Mexican immigrants, about Mexico's not sending their best and calling Mexicans rapists and all that type of thing. Again, I'm Chilean, but in that moment it didn't matter. He was talking about immigrants, right? So many people, there's a joke that so many people in the United States just see Latin America as one big Mexico. So it didn't matter that he was talking about Mexicans. And so that coupled with liberal media being critical of AMLO and painting him as being a narco president and a demagogue. That's when, at least that's what motivated me to start doing political education in DSA. And I just, I really go back to that moment when Trump said that, about Mexico not bringing them not sending their best. I just remember thinking, like, Europe is a Hitler factory. Like, what does the United States, what does Europe export? It's just violence. How dare he say anything about Latin America? When was the last time, Mexico invaded? Like, it was just such a, if you know anything about global history, you can understand how absolutely absurd that comment was.
So I wanted to ask, kind of building on the same theme here, so you've talked about this being inspirational. In fact, I got goosebumps listening to you talk just now. What does the work look like moving forward? So what are you going to do to try to further inspire people so that, that this continues to grow, that they have that same sensation that you had, the same kind of impulse to want to be able to share what's happening? And also, I think you made an interesting point, right? How to bridge that divide, right? I think there is a challenge there of, well, I can't identify with Claudia Sheinbaum, right? Although maybe they can more because she looks a little bit more like them, right? And she comes from a middle-class background. So what do you think are some of the strategies that you can put into practice to be able to penetrate, to, as we say sometimes, break that blockade, that media blockade, in order to be able to, as we've been talking about, make it reach further, inspire more people, hopefully start to make those kinds of changes within the United States as well?
The first thing I'm going to tell them is to listen to the Soberania podcast.
Thank you for that pitch there. And for our Spanish-speaking people, check out La Cuatro TV also on YouTube.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief here and leave some space for others to comment as well. But I'm serious. The Soberania podcast is awesome, and I listen to it regularly. I was particularly, so when I think about next steps from this election, right? Obviously, I've been taken aback by the results across the country, but I've been particularly taken aback by some of the results abroad in the United States for obvious reasons relevant to us, right? I think the expectation, at least for us, was that the abroad voting in the United States might not be as high as it could be, considering there are millions of Mexicans that can vote. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head now, but I do know that the numbers were larger than folks anticipated, right? I saw tweets and messages on social media of lines in places like Chicago, right, which were across the building, across consulates. And I can be corrected if I'm wrong, but I think this might have been the first election where voting was allowed at a lot of different consulates, so that's obviously another reason. I want to organize those people, right? I want those people to know that they have a home in the United States for this brand of politics, right? And I want to work closer, and I think there's space for DSA to be able to work closer with Morena in doing so, right? I think the other side of that coin is doing more of this, election observing, but with more people from our organization, right? I want to go to Ecuador next year, right? I want to help. When I see everything that's happening in Ecuador, it breaks my heart, you know? I want to go to Ecuador next year. I want to go to Peru and Colombia the year after, right? Doing these sorts of things, bringing people to the United States out of their middle-class shells and showing them what's happening here, right? So they can understand it for themselves and bring that knowledge back, right? So when I think of two big next steps for us within the organization, I think of those two things, right? Being able to engage with and talk with the evidently large base of Morena voters that exists in the United States, right? And being able to use that to raise the political consciousness of members within our organization so that ultimately we can bring more folks to these things in the future. Because once again, these things are popular and enjoy a wide degree of support within our organization.
Any else want to jump in on that? Kurt, we haven't heard from you. I know you're on the other end of the table. Maybe you can pass the mic to him.
This is all actually very inspiring, and I'm really excited to see what happens going forward with this. I did have one more question if we have time for it, which I think it speaks to what you've been saying about kind of the middle class whiteness of the U.S. left. Something I think has mystified a lot of people on this side over the last few years is kind of not so much people or the U.S. left ignoring Mexico, which is bad enough, but kind of dismissing Morena as being not left enough. That's worse, actually, because on one hand, it's ignoring, a movement that has, raised the minimum wage 120%, passed a national pension, infrastructure projects, conservation projects, stopping outsourcing, union reform. I mean, it's a pretty, impressive slate of reforms, just on the face of it, right? Whether people are kind of following it or not. But this kind of idea that from the US, we can qualify what another country's movement is, and if it doesn't meet our standards, we sit it out, right? To get to where Morena got, it cost a lot of blood, a lot of lives lost. The party before Morena, the PRD, there were hundreds of martyrs of the PRD back in the 80s and 90s. There've been periodic repressions, people disappeared. It's taken a lot to get to where Morena got. It didn't just happen. It wasn't just spontaneous combustion. Where does this come from? Where does this idea come from that, all of a sudden, it's not, and of course we can always discuss where a movement should go and where they've failed and where they've succeeded and where they should be better. That is important. But I think it's much worse to say, oh, they're just, that's not left. Where does this come from, and how can that be particularly attacked? 'Cause I think that's a very difficult one.
From my point of view, the US left has no room to criticize anybody in the world in terms of their movement, because we have to understand what is the United States on the world stage. The US left broadly understands that the US is an empire. Well, in concrete terms, there has not been a reckoning as to what that means. The US is the only country in the world that has bases in every single continent on the planet, has military bases that is funded by US tax dollars, and to do what? there is an old school Leninist idea of that imperialism is merely the extension of the financial ruling class, extending its reach outside of its domestic borders to increase profit. While I think that's true, I think it's incomplete. In the past few decades, political economists, sociologists, and historians, part of a movement that can best be described as world systems theory, understands and tells us, posits the idea that the world is a coherent system. If that sounds very, I don't know, obvious, then perhaps we have to reckon with how difficult it is to see from the view of within the imperial core, within the empire. Why do I say this? When you're within a system that the country that you're a part of is at the top, and this is not a exaggeration, this is not a subjective claim, this is just an objective matter of fact of the state of the world that we live in, that the United States is the most powerful country on earth. And how is that power maintained? It is through brutal wars, invasions, interventions, assassinations, destruction of entire societies. In fact, one could argue, as the late economist Samir Amin, as the current economist, philosopher Ali Qadri, professor at Sun Yat-sen University, says that the goal, particularly in the Arab region, but this is true broadly of US foreign policy, is to de-develop countries, to de-develop the existing developmental projects that exist in many nations. To do what? For destruction? Ali Qadri argues, yes, but why? And it's because if there are existing capital pools, that are owned even if by the ruling classes of different countries, what matters is that it's not the US's ruling class. And so when the entire political economic structure of the world system that we live in, its nexus is the US ruling class and its extension through its allies, like NATO, then what you end up reproducing is a perspective that is viewing everything from above. Everything is conditional on reproducing the existing society. And so in terms of what was said earlier about immigration, what is immigration in the context of the US? Why do people move? Why would you move if your life is going well? Truly, right? People move for work, sure. People move because they want to explore the world. These are normal human desires, societal necessities. But by and large, people move because they want to escape or get something better out of where they're going to. And so why do people move to the US? Because, as mentioned before, the US is the most powerful country in the world, but also because we live in a capitalist world system, this also means it's the richest country in the world. And so, in terms of the earlier of this levels of how do we say, generations who have moved here, what we need to kind of come to terms with is there are generations of people who have moved to the United States that are really refugees of imperialism. And so there's a really fascinating contradiction, a unresolvable reality manifesting in the United States where and liberals and conservatives talk about this, they both believe some version of this, that white people in the US are being replaced. And they debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, as if non-white people believe the same thing. They're all progressives, right? Rather, what we should believe is that all people deserve the right to express themselves, to choose for their own self how their history is determined. And so, in terms of what needs to be done within the US, and now I mistakenly said earlier the late economist Senator Amin, now I'll quote him now, he talked about this idea of the long revolution of the global south. Why? Because if you look at the development of capitalism in world history, it was the periphery of the existing world system of basically a tribute-paying mode of production, that basically this periphery that existed in the place we call Europe, that is where capitalism developed. And this is why, historically, in the past 200 years, the most successful revolutions for self-determination against imperialism, against capitalism, have happened in the global south. And so within the US, it must be coming from those who have come from the periphery, and we must look towards the successful revolution that's coming from the global south.
Hello, hello. Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of points, and I think those points are, very related to what Jorge said, but I can't process it fast enough to make that point about how they're related. So I would say the first reason for this kind of extremely unhelpful arrogance on the part of US leftists is internalized liberal white supremacy. That is to say, and I think Jorge mentioned this as well, but that, often white people come to socialism and they think that because they're socialists, they are not still influenced by the, racist, I'll just say racist, I could say a lot of other isms, but basically, the kind of garbage ideology in which we're raised in the United States. But that's kind of, as well as the social and political struggle where that is resolved, it's also a struggle within us for our whole lives to be able to identify, and if we have bad instincts based on, American ideology, then we have to defeat that within ourselves by being in the struggle. And so I think that's one of the problems, is to, in the struggle, show how, those backward ideas will defeat us if we don't defeat them. The second thing I would say about it is that, we've had some great struggles in US history and in my lifetime, but the left has always been very far from winning, very far from what Morena and El Movimiento have accomplished. And so it's really easy to be a leftist and to fall in the US and to fall into one of two errors. You can either become a total idealist because you don't have a big practice to critique and see what works and what doesn't. So you fall into intense idealism that has no relationship to material reality, even if you might think you're a dialectical materialist. And, and the other is cynicism and giving up and going for total reformism, without keeping that vision of complete social and political transformation, and the last shall be first, like putting the poor and the working class at the top. So I think those are two errors. But one of the good things about DSA is that we are having these internal struggles. And interestingly enough, I think you probably know that DSA is what we call a multi-tendency organization. That is to say, we have communists, anarchists, socialists, social democrats, you name it. However, even opposing tendencies in DSA are studying 21st century socialism, Cesar Chavez, and so on. And they come up with different ways to apply that to the United States, but at least they're paying attention, and we are trying to intensify that kind of political education internally and externally. But, you know, my hope is that DSA will succeed in transforming itself into a multilingual, people of color-led, immigrant-led movement and eventually party, because you know, you have to, the bottom up has to rise up so that everybody is lifted, rather than just a kind of educated middle class, even if they, you know, are workers, they're not capitalists. That's all I have to say for now, thanks.
That was perfect, yeah. I love that. Yeah, I would say it's, a lot of it has to do with understanding socialism from a textbook. And again, it goes back to why it's so important that we're here, is to see, is to escape the hegemony that is the United States, is to try to purge this, so many messages that we internalize subconsciously about the global South that are often racist, that are racist and classist. And another thing I would say is, again, it goes back to a class issue in that so many people in the United States don't understand what it's like to live in poverty. And more than anything, to live a life where every day is a struggle for dignity. So even in the United States, I grew up poor, but we still had running water. That's not necessarily the case when I visit family in Latin America, right? The difference is, I like to say, is that, you know, we didn't have running water or electricity when I grew up because we didn't pay the bill, right? We just had to wait. But it's different in Latin America because sometimes oftentimes it's an infrastructure problem, right? That's a distinction. You know, a lot of people don't understand what it's like to travel hours by bus just to get to work, right? And just understand what AMLO, what 4T, the means by which it has improved people's lives, right? We saw earlier, a couple days ago, we were walking through a park. It was Austin and I, and there was an older gentleman who was selling candy, right? We just, in the beginning, we just kind of walked past him because everybody's selling everything in Mexico City. But, you know, I started thinking about what does 4T mean to that guy? What does Morena mean to that man? You know, he was probably in his 70s, something like that. But you know what? Maybe it means that with his pension, he's only selling candy for 3 hours out of the day instead of 6 or 7. That's meaningful. That is profoundly meaningful for someone who's living in Mexico, right? And that's the thing that people struggle with in the United States to understand, because they've never gone through those experiences, and they don't understand what even incremental changes to the social safety net can mean in your day-to-day struggle.
Go ahead.
Just one last thing, and I think it's important to say this, and it'd be remiss to not mention this. Everything we're talking about is most exemplified with what's happening to the Palestinian people in Gaza. And when you see the way that Palestinian people talk about what is occurring, that their lives, their culture, their society is being destroyed, and yet they don't give up. But also, with what I said earlier, that those who are displaced are really political refugees. So in this way, we're all Palestinian.
So we're almost at the end here. I don't know if I wanted to give an opportunity to Kurt, if you want to share some words before we close here, some parting words to our audience on this special program here between Soberanía and the 4TV.
Just thank everyone involved in putting this together, everybody here at 4TV, everybody at Morena, and congratulations for an incredible day yesterday. Thanks for everybody here on the panel. I think there's a lot to take away from yesterday. You know, I was up very early. We went to vote at our precinct in Oaxaca. Then we jumped on a plane. We got here. We wound up, without even expecting it, in Morena headquarters. Jose Luis and I, we were doing the podcasts. We were getting all kinds of engagement. People wanted to know what was going on. You know, we wound up seeing Claudia come out of her suite and make her victory speech. And then we all walked down to the Zocalo after midnight. You know, with the whole contingent there, and then, you know, even at that late hour, you know, people who were still at that hour selling out on the streets, as Luisa mentioned, were, you know, cheering everybody on the way down. Morena has created, López Obrador, what we all want, which is a consciousness of class and a consciousness of sovereignty, you know. In the United States, patriotism is a very problematic word on the left because it's tied to an imperial project. In Mexico, patriotism is a different thing. It's, you know, not selling out to, you know, the U.S. elites in foreign capital like the Mexican right does, you know, the PAN, the PRI, right? It's really creating a national project and a regional project, right? And that's always been interesting to me for someone who I'm an immigrant to Mexico. To see this national project under construction is inspiring. And I hope more people in the US of Mexican heritage and not can know more about what's happening here, because it's inspiring. So maybe we can end there.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to share some my thoughts on that last exchange there. And I'll begin by saying it's a privilege to be able to share a table with everybody here. I do think that this is maybe a moment we'll point to. We'll say, remember when we were in a room in Mexico City, beginning and exploring this conversation, look how far we've gotten. And I wanted to talk about that in the context of the election. You know, the comrade here was talking about how it's just not helpful. This sneering attitude is just not helpful. And ultimately, I think if we got down to it, if we had a struggle session, we'd probably end up agreeing that some of the contradictions need to be resolved more quickly here in Mexico. I understand that. I believe in the communalization of life. But you know what? We are way closer to the communalization of life in Mexico today than we were 2 days ago. And that's really significant. And when we think about things in a working class perspective, I always mention this because, you know, we can talk about the statistics, we can talk about the people lifting out of poverty, about the dignity that's been restored to so many people, the anecdotes that we just heard. But I'd like to talk about it in a personal way. I'm a working class person. I live off of my labor power. I don't have any income from rent in that sense. You know, I have a family, and watching the results come in yesterday, I know my family is going to be healthier and happier thanks to the victory of Clara Brugada here in the capital and Claudia Sheinbaum at the federal level. And that cannot be discounted. And I'm so glad that there are people that understand that, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to convince people more. And I'll end with a pitch, which is that the same pitch that I gave when I was doing the speaking tour, which is that it's not helpful to be sneering, to judge casting aspersions on our political process, but you know what is helpful? Joining the anti-imperialist struggle. Look how far Mexico has gotten. And some of us are even shocked at how far things have actually gotten in terms of the success of yesterday. You know what's holding us back? What could keep us from pursuing the communalization of life? It's U.S. imperialism. And you know who has a primary duty to dismantle U.S. imperialism? It's the working class inside of the United States. But I know that the people at this table are actually engaged in that work, and I know they're going to be very successful in being able to get more people to join that anti-imperialist struggle. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us today and in watching our program. This has been a special presentation of the Soberanía Podcast, Mexican Politics Podcast, and La Cuatro TV. We'll see you next time.